It was an ordinary Saturday morning in the Turner household, or so it seemed. The sun filtered through the curtains, casting soft beams of light onto the hardwood floors. Maria Turner was sipping her coffee, enjoying the rare quiet moment before her son, Evan, woke up. The neighborhood outside was peaceful, the air crisp with a kind of calm that makes you feel like nothing could go wrong. But it wouldn't last. Maria's eyes flicked toward the front window, a familiar chill running down her spine. Two men stood on her porch, their figures outlined in the soft morning light. Their uniforms looked official, well-pressed, badges gleaming. At first glance, they seemed like typical Homeowners Association, HOA, officers, here for one of those routine neighborhood safety checks that no one ever really asked for. But Maria's instincts, honed over years of military training, immediately told her something was wrong. Why today? She thought, her grip tightening on her coffee mug. Maria had lived in this neighborhood for years, and never once had an HOA officer shown up unannounced. And never had they come alone. She walked quietly to the door, pulling it open just enough to peer through the crack. The men's voices drifted to her, smooth and rehearsed. "Good morning, ma'am," one of them said, his tone too polished, too calm. "We're with the HOA. We're conducting some safety checks in the neighborhood, and we need to speak to you about your son, Evan. It's urgent." Maria's stomach tightened. Evan. He was just in the yard, playing with his toys. Why did they need to speak to her about him? And why so urgently? "Is everything okay?" She called out from behind the door, trying to keep her voice steady. Inside, she could feel her pulse quickening, a sense of unease building in her gut. One of the men stepped forward, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just a quick check. Nothing to worry about." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "For your son's safety." Safety. Maria felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine. Why were they so focused on Evan? She had to make sure he was out of harm's way. Now, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she glanced toward the yard. Evan was still playing, unaware that anything was wrong. But she could sense it. Something was wrong. Without a word, Maria took a step back, her military-trained instincts kicking into overdrive. Her eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign of trouble. "It's too quiet," she thought, her mind racing. She noticed the second man had his hands clasped together behind his back, a position that didn't seem natural. And then it hit her, their eyes. There was something off about their gaze, too focused, too calculating. Maria's hand instinctively reached for the phone in her pocket, but before she could dial, the first man spoke again, his voice smooth but insistent. "We're going to need you to come out, ma'am. It's very important. We talked to Evan. Just a quick check." Maria's heart skipped a beat. She knew she was facing more than just two officers. This wasn't about the HOA. This was something far more dangerous. "Stay inside, Evan," Maria shouted to her son, her voice firm but laced with urgency. She didn't wait for a response before she slammed the door shut and quickly locked it. The men exchanged a brief, knowing glance. Maria's pulse raced. The trap had been set. Now, it was time to get her son to safety. Maria's heart thudded in her chest as she stepped back into the living room. Her hands trembled for a split second, but she quickly regained control, her mind calculating every move with the precision only someone with her training could muster. She locked the front door behind her and glanced toward the kitchen, where Evan was still playing with his action figures on the floor, blissfully unaware of the danger creeping closer. Maria couldn't let her fear show. She had to think clearly. This wasn't just an HOA visit. She could feel it in her bones. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her fingers moving with the muscle memory of someone who had done this too many times before. The phone rang, and she was about to speak when the call dropped out. The signal was gone. They must have jammed it, she thought, cursing under her breath. The men had planned this. Her eyes darted to the window, scanning the front yard. The two men were still standing there, exchanging low, hurried words. She couldn't hear them, but their body language spoke volumes. They weren't just waiting. They were watching, waiting for her to make the first mistake. She turned to Ivan, who looked up at her, still smiling, unaware of the rising tension. His innocent face filled her with a sudden surge of protective instinct. Not today, she thought. She couldn't lose him. Not to this. Maria moved quietly through the house, checking every lock on every window, every door. As she passed the hallway, she heard the faint sound of one of the men's footsteps on the porch. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The man was getting closer. Why was he approaching so soon? Just as she ducked into the hallway closet, the doorbell rang, loud, piercing, and insistent. Maria's heart skipped a beat. She didn't move. She couldn't risk them hearing her. The bell rang again, and then a knock followed. Sharp, quick, as though someone was impatient. The second man's voice came through the door now, calm, almost too smooth. "Ma'am," he called, his tone filled with false concern. "We really need to talk to Ivan. It's part of a community safety check. It won't take long, but we need to make sure everything is in order for his safety." Maria's jaw clenched. Safety. He had used that word before. But now, she could hear something else in his voice, urgency. She had no time to waste. These men weren't here for a safety check. They were here to take her son. She felt it in every fiber of her being. They had already targeted him, and now they were closing in. Then, the worst thing happened. Ivan stood up from the floor, his small footsteps echoing in the hallway. Maria's breath caught in her throat. "Mom." Ivan's voice was soft, innocent. Maria's mind raced. She couldn't let him open the door. Not now. She quickly moved toward him, her eyes frantic as she whispered, "Ivan, go to your room. Lock the door, and don't come out. Understand?" He hesitated, sensing the sudden shift in the air, but nodded. His eyes, wide with confusion, filled with trust as he turned and sprinted down the hallway toward his bedroom. Good. He's safe for now. Maria's thoughts snapped back to the door. The men were still waiting. She crept toward the door, carefully positioning herself behind the wall next to the entrance. From the crack in the door, she could see one of the men through the peephole. He was staring at the door, his eyes narrowing, as if he could sense her behind it. Her fingers brushed the cold handle of the nearby kitchen knife, and her breath steadied. Whatever happened next, she wasn't going to let them take her son. Not without a fight. The seconds felt like hours, but then the man spoke again, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "We know you're in there. You've made this more difficult than it needed to be. Open the door, and we'll make sure your son doesn't get hurt. Resist, and you'll regret it." Maria's grip tightened on the knife. This wasn't just about Ivan anymore. It was about survival. Maria's breath came in short, controlled bursts, her entire focus narrowing to the men on the porch. She could feel her heartbeat pulsing in her ears, but she couldn't let it overwhelm her. Stay calm. Stay in control, she reminded herself, her military training kicking in like a second skin. Every muscle in her body was coiled, ready to spring into action. The man outside, the one who had been speaking earlier, stepped forward again. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if he knew she was inside, waiting, preparing. Maria's mind raced as she silently crept closer to the door, positioning herself just out of sight. She kept her grip on the kitchen knife steady, its cold metal a reassuring presence in her hand. She dared a glance through the peephole, her stomach dropping as she saw the man scanning the surroundings, his eyes flicking nervously from side to side. He was listening, waiting for any sound, any sign that she had made a mistake. The silence between them seemed to stretch, too quiet, too thick, as if the world itself was holding its breath. "Ma'am," the man called out again, his voice too sweet, too calm. "We know you're in there. You don't want to make this more difficult for your son. Please open the door." Maria's pulse quickened. The way he said, "your son," it wasn't just a request. It was a threat. A warning. The second man, the one who had been standing further back, suddenly moved. He was circling the side of the house, his shadow creeping toward the window. "He's trying to get inside," Maria realized with a jolt. She hadn't considered that. They could force their way in. She was trapped. In a flash, she was moving, her heart pounding, her instincts screaming. Maria sprinted toward the back of the house, gripping the knife so tightly her fingers began to ache. She couldn't afford to waste time. There was no way she was going to let these men get their hands on Ivan. He was still in his room, his door shut and locked. She had moments, maybe seconds, to act before things escalated beyond her control. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Ivan's bedroom door crack open just a little. She froze. No, her worst fear was unfolding right in front of her. Ivan was coming out of his room. He doesn't know. "Ivan, stay in your room. Now," Maria hissed in a low, urgent whisper, her voice sharp and fierce. The seconds stretched like hours. She watched as her son hesitated at the threshold of his room, his small face twisted in confusion. Maria's heart wrenched. He didn't understand. He wasn't old enough to understand what was really happening. But there was no time for hesitation. She needed him safe. Now, with every ounce of strength, she held back the panic threatening to rise in her chest and moved quickly, crossing the hallway in 2 long strides, her boots barely making a sound against the hardwood floor. She reached her son just as he was about to step out, pulling him back into his room and slamming the door shut behind her. The sound echoed in the silence. "Stay down. Lock the door. Don't come out unless I say so," she ordered in a low voice, her words clipped. Her eyes met his, filled with an unspoken promise. She wasn't going to let anything happen to him. Ivan's eyes filled with worry, but he nodded, obedient as always, and crawled under his bed, hiding as she had taught him in the event of danger. Maria didn't have time to reassure him further. She had to move fast. She darted for the back door, her hand on the knob just as she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps at the front. They were making their move. The second man was at the window now, his face a ghostly silhouette through the curtains. Her stomach dropped as his eyes flicked toward the door. He saw her. Time seemed to stop. Maria's mind flashed through every scenario. She could hear the faint echo of footsteps approaching from the front. The walls were closing in. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and they knew she wasn't going to give up without a fight. They'll regret this, Maria thought. And with that, she moved. Maria's pulse raced as she quietly slipped through the kitchen, her eyes scanning the room for anything she could use to defend herself. Her mind was a blur of calculations, each one darker than the last. They were getting closer. She could hear their voices outside now, low, muffled, but unmistakably tense. The first man was speaking again, his voice sharp with frustration. "Ma'am, we don't want this to escalate. Open the door, and no one gets hurt." Maria's hands were steady, but her mind was a whirlwind. She had trained for hostile situations in foreign lands, but this was different. These men weren't soldiers or criminals. They were something much worse. They knew about her. They knew what she could do. And now, they were using her son to force her hand. She clenched her jaw. This wasn't just a neighborhood safety check. This was a carefully orchestrated trap. But who was behind it? She could feel her heart pounding in her throat. There was no time to waste. She needed to outsmart them, keep them at bay until the authorities arrived, or until she could create an opening to escape with Ivan. The sound of another knock broke her concentration. Her eyes flicked to the back door. The second man was gone. Where did he go? No time to think. React. Maria quickly moved to the back window, careful not to make a sound. She peeked through the blinds. What she saw made her blood run cold. The second man was crouched low, his hand gripping a set of tools, prying instruments, aimed at the window lock. He was going to force his way in. He was ready to breach the house. Her stomach twisted, This wasn't just about getting inside anymore. They were desperate. They were willing to do anything. Her eyes snapped to the front door. The first man was still standing there, but his demeanor had shifted. He wasn't the polite, soft-spoken officer he'd started as. He was more aggressive now, his eyes darting from side to side, constantly on alert. His hand was resting on the radio strapped to his waist, his finger twitching toward the button. Maria's instincts screamed at her to move. The tension in the house was suffocating, every sound amplified in the quiet. Even was still hidden in his room, and for now, that was the only thing keeping him safe. But Maria's window of opportunity was closing fast. She moved silently toward the back door, her breath controlled. She needed to act quickly. Before she could open the door, however, the worst possible thing happened. A low hum echoed through the house, the unmistakable sound of a van engine. Her pulse shot up. More of them. She rushed to the window, pulling back the blinds just enough to catch a glimpse. The van was black, unmarked, its tires screeching to a halt right in front of her driveway. This was no coincidence. Two men climbed out, their faces masked, and their bodies bulky, clearly armed. Their movements were precise, coordinated, like soldiers, like trained professionals. But they weren't just any soldiers. These men had been watching her. They had been tracking her every move. And now, they were here for even. Maria's mind raced. This was bigger than just some HOA scam. She took a deep breath and scanned the room for anything she could use as a weapon. Her eyes landed on the fireplace poker across the room. It wasn't much, but it would do. She grabbed it, her fingers curling around the cold iron handle, and moved to the door, ready to fight. As the front door began to creak open, Maria positioned herself, crouched low, waiting. Her mind flashed to even. He's safe for now. Stay hidden, baby. The first man's voice broke through the silence again. Enough games, ma'am. Open the door. We're coming in. With a sudden burst of speed, Maria yanked the door open, throwing her full weight into a surprise attack. The man at the door was knocked back, stumbling. The second man, still working on the window, turned just in time to see her move. But it was already too late. Maria swung the fireplace poker with brutal precision, the heavy iron head connecting with the first man's wrist. He screamed, dropping the radio, which clattered to the ground. The second man was already charging toward her, but she was faster. She dodged his grab, spinning behind him and using her elbow to drive into his back. He crumpled, disoriented but still dangerous. The fight was on. Maria's body surged with adrenaline as she faced down the two men in front of her. The fireplace poker was heavy in her hands, but it was the only weapon she had, and it was enough. Her mind was focused, calculating each move with military precision. She could hear the men's rapid breaths, the pounding of her own heart in her ears. This was no longer about protecting her son. Now, it was about surviving long enough to get him out of harm's way. The first man, his wrist shattered by the blow, scrambled back, his face twisted in pain. The second man, bigger, faster, lunged at her with a growl. His hand shot forward, aiming to grab her throat. But Maria was ready. She sidestepped, using the momentum to swing the poker around in a vicious arc, striking the man in the ribs. He grunted in pain, staggering back, but quickly recovering. He wasn't going down that easily. Maria's mind raced as she backed toward the hallway, her eyes never leaving the second man's gaze. Focus, stay calm, wait for your moment. Every movement was deliberate, measured. She couldn't afford a mistake now. These weren't ordinary thugs. They were trained, well-equipped, and relentless. The first man was recovering, and the second was already closing the gap. The second man swiped at her, his hand catching the poker, trying to wrench it from her grasp. Maria's muscles screamed in protest, but she held on. She twisted her body, using the leverage of his own force to bring the poker up sharply toward his throat. It was a precise strike, a desperate one, but it was enough to force him back, just for a second. She used the brief pause to adjust her stance, her feet planted firmly. She kept the poker between herself and the attackers, ready to strike again if necessary. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement in the shadows, a silhouette in the doorway. Even. Her heart lurched in her chest. No. She hadn't told him to come out. The last thing she needed was him seeing the chaos. She couldn't risk it. Even. Get back. She screamed, her voice raw, but commanding. Her son, wide-eyed and frozen, stood at the edge of the hallway, watching the struggle unfold. His small hands were shaking. She could see the terror in his eyes, and for a split second, everything seemed to slow. The sound of her heart pounding, the tension in the air, it all vanished for a fraction of a second. Then the second man moved again, this time with terrifying speed. He reached for her, grabbing her by the arm with a vice-like grip. No time for hesitation. Maria's breath was quick, her vision narrowing. She twisted in his grip, throwing her knee into his groin with every ounce of force she had left. The man gasped, stumbling back. She didn't waste the opportunity. She threw her weight into a shoulder check, knocking him into the wall with a sickening thud. For a moment, he stayed down, gasping for air, but Maria knew it wouldn't last. They were too persistent. They would keep coming, and soon there would be more. She backed up, her eyes darting around for an exit strategy. She had no illusions about escaping. She couldn't run, not with Even in the house. Her only option was to get him to safety, to force the men out before they got any closer to him. Her gaze met Evan's for the briefest moment, and she saw the fear in his eyes. She had failed him. Not again. Go to your room, Even. Lock the door. Don't come out. I promise I'll protect you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, a promise she would keep. The second man grunted as he pushed himself up from the floor, fury in his eyes. He wasn't done. He was already moving back toward her, faster this time. Suddenly, the front door slammed open with a deafening bang, and Maria's heart stopped. More of them. But the voice that followed wasn't one she had expected. Police, get down. Maria's heart leaped in her chest as the sound of boots pounding on the porch reached her ears. Finally, help was here. For the first time since the attack began, the men hesitated. Their attention shifted to the door, and Maria seized the opportunity. She sprang forward, shoving the second man away, her breath coming in ragged bursts. The first man, still clutching his wrist, looked from the door to Maria. His eyes burned with rage, but he knew the game was up. He turned on his heel and bolted, disappearing into the backyard. The second man, still dazed from the earlier blows, was tackled to the ground by one of the officers just as he lunged toward Maria. She could hear the shouts, the scuffle, but all that mattered was the fact that Even was safe. He was still hidden in his room. Maria's hands were shaking, the adrenaline beginning to fade, but she didn't allow herself to relax. Not yet. Not until her son was out of harm's way. The room was still, but the air was thick with tension. Maria's hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of what had just happened. The officers had arrived. Help was here. And yet, there was no sense of relief. The danger wasn't over. Not yet. She stood frozen, eyes darting toward the front door, where two more police officers had entered, their guns drawn, their stances alert. They had the men pinned to the floor, but Maria's mind was elsewhere. How had they found her so quickly? And why did the attack feel so personal? Her thoughts were interrupted by the harsh voice of one of the officers. "Ma'am, we need you to step aside," he ordered, gesturing for her to move back. "We need to secure the area." Maria didn't flinch. She couldn't. Not when she had to make sure Even was still safe. Not when there was still the nagging feeling that something was off, that this wasn't just some random attack. "Is he okay?" Maria asked, her voice tight as she glanced toward Evan's door, still shut. The officer hesitated. "He's fine, ma'am. He's with another officer now. You're safe." She nodded, But her mind was spinning. The first wave of fear had passed, but a second, deeper wave was rising. Why was this happening? The first man, now pinned to the ground, struggled beneath the weight of the officer's knee on his back. His face was bruised, his eyes wild, but it was the second man who was making her blood run cold. His eyes never left her. He wasn't done. He was watching her like a predator. Maria's gut twisted. There was something wrong. She couldn't place it, but the whole situation felt off. She had been in enough life and death scenarios to know when something didn't add up. Who were these people? And why hadn't they said anything about why they were targeting her? She moved toward the living room window, keeping low. The officers were busy with the men, but Maria couldn't let her guard down. What if there were more of them? As she peered through the blinds, her worst fear was realized. A black SUV, unmarked, was pulling into her driveway. The engine hummed loudly, its tinted windows reflecting the dim light of the fading day. A chill crawled up her spine. This wasn't the police. This wasn't even another group of attackers. It was something else. Something worse. She stepped back from the window, heart pounding in her chest. Her body went into autopilot. She needed to protect Ivan. She needed to keep him safe. Before she could take another step, one of the officers came over to her. "Ma'am, I need you to stay with us. We're going to get you both out of here. It's not safe." No. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the air. She wasn't leaving her house, not while there was still the chance of more danger. "You don't understand. These men," she began, but the officer cut her off. "They're just thugs, ma'am. We've got it under control." Maria shook her head. "You don't get it. They're not thugs. They've been watching me. I know who they are, or at least, I know what they want. You need to leave the house. Get out of here now." The officer seemed to hesitate for a moment, but Maria's eyes were unwavering. The SUV was getting closer, its presence like an ominous cloud hovering over them. She didn't know who was inside, but she knew one thing. They were here for her. Without thinking, Maria grabbed the officer by the arm, her grip iron tight. "You need to listen to me. There's a bigger game at play here. These men are only the start. That SUV, it's not just another vehicle. They're coming for me." The officer's eyes flicked toward the driveway, then back at her, his expression conflicted. But before he could respond, the sound of a door slamming shut echoed through the house. Too late. The front door was kicked open with an explosion of force. The officers turned, their guns raised, but the man who stepped into the room was wearing no uniform, no badge. He was dressed in black, his features obscured by a dark mask. "Don't even think about it," the man growled, his voice deep and smooth, like it had been conditioned over years of practice. He was holding something in his hand, a device, small and silver, its glowing red light a silent countdown. Maria's blood ran cold. "Drop your weapons," the masked man ordered, his eyes flicking to the officers. "Or your friend dies." The officer in front of her stiffened, his gun still raised, but the man's weapon had already been pressed against the back of the second officer's head. "You don't understand." Maria's voice was low but steady. "If you don't leave right now, this won't end the way you think it will." But the man didn't flinch. He smiled, a dangerous grin that chilled her to the bone. "I think you're about to find out just how wrong you are." Maria's heart slammed against her ribs as she locked eyes with the masked man standing in her doorway. The cold, unblinking red light from his device seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own, its glow painting his shadowed face with an eerie glow. She had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. The cold confidence in the man's eyes sent a chill through her bones, an unsettling certainty that whatever he had planned would not be easy to stop. One of the officers, still clutching his weapon, hesitated, his hands shaking slightly. The man with the device seemed to sense this weakness. "Drop it." His voice was calm, almost polite, but it carried the weight of a threat Maria recognized all too well. The officer's hand faltered, his gaze flicking to Maria, who could see the fear creeping into his eyes. Maria's mind raced. She couldn't afford to waste time. This wasn't just about fighting anymore. It was about controlling the narrative. If she didn't act now, she didn't know when she'd get another chance. But before she could make a move, the man stepped further into the room, his gaze never leaving her. "We don't need to fight, Maria. We both know how this ends. Just cooperate, and we'll leave quietly." The way he said her name sent a jolt of panic through her. How did he know my name? She hadn't been in this neighborhood long enough for anyone to have uncovered her past. No one knew her full history, not even her neighbors. And yet this man, this stranger, seemed to know everything. Maria swallowed her rising panic and tried to focus. Think, stay in control. Her eyes flicked quickly to the officers. They weren't moving, their guns still raised but hesitating, unwilling to take the first shot. She could see their doubt, their unwillingness to truly risk everything for a fight they didn't fully understand. Maria stepped forward slowly, positioning herself between the masked man and the officers. Her heart pounded in her ears, but she refused to let the fear show. The lives of everyone in this room hung in the balance. "I'm not going to let you control this situation," she said, her voice tight but fierce. "And I'm not going to let you hurt my son." The masked man's lips quirked into a smirk, as if her words amused him. "Oh, Maria," he said softly, almost sympathetically. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about your son. This isn't about you. This is much bigger than that." Her stomach clenched as his words hit like a punch. Bigger. What did he mean? She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, and the chill creeping up her spine told her that whatever this was, it wasn't just some random attack. This was a carefully orchestrated move, and whoever was behind it had a far greater agenda than she could possibly understand. The masked man reached into his jacket, pulling out a small device, similar to a phone, but with a digital screen flickering with encrypted lines of code. His fingers tapped rapidly, and she could see the faintest smile tug at his lips. "You see," he continued, as if explaining a simple truth, "we've been watching you for a very long time. You're not the first target in this game, but you will be the last if you don't cooperate." A sinking feeling spread through Maria's chest. Watched her. For how long? She shook her head, her breath shallow. "What game? What do you want with me?" The man's smile grew colder. "We need someone like you, Maria. Someone with your skills. You were meant for this, all of it. And now it's time for you to play your part." The words didn't make sense, but a horrible thought began to form in Maria's mind. Skills. The word rang in her ears. She knew what he meant. Her training, her past in the special forces, her skills in combat, in survival, in keeping secrets. They had been watching her because they knew who she was. "Whatever you think this is," Maria said, her voice low and dangerous, "you don't know who you're messing with." But the masked man just chuckled, the sound cold and humorless. "You don't know who we are," he replied, his eyes narrowing, "and we're not leaving until we have what we came for." Maria's pulse quickened. What was he talking about? What did they want? Before she could process, she heard the faint sound of a door opening behind her. Even. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't realized how close she was to the hallway, or how dangerously exposed Evan's room was to the chaos. She turned, eyes widening as she saw her son standing there, his small form outlined in the doorway, his innocent face filled with confusion and fear. "Mom." Evan's voice trembled, barely above a whisper. "What's going on?" Maria's mind went into overdrive. This was the moment. This was the moment she had to protect him. "Evan, get back into your room. Now," she commanded, her voice rough with urgency. The cold barrel of the gun pressed against the side of Maria's neck. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out everything else. "Evan, stay behind me. Please, stay behind me." Her eyes locked onto the small figure of her son, frozen in the doorway. The world seemed to slow, her breath shallow, her every nerve screaming for action. The masked man was dangerously close, his smirk now a twisted symbol of his control over the situation. They'd been watching her for a long time. They knew everything about her. Everything. And yet she wasn't going to give in. Not this time. Not when it came to even. "I've given you every chance, Maria." The man's voice was cold, deliberate. "You're an asset, a valuable one. But if you're too stubborn to see the bigger picture, I'll make you see it another way." Her fingers clenched at her sides, but she didn't make a move. Her mind was working, frantically calculating the situation. He was too close. The gun was too quick. And if she moved, even would be in even more danger. Her training, her years in the special forces, had taught her the value of patience. But the stakes had never been so high. The officer who had been closest to her, still standing with his gun raised, seemed paralyzed by indecision. He had been trained for situations like this, but his hesitation was like a tangible force in the air. He didn't understand what was really at play here. He didn't know what Maria was capable of, what she had done in the past to survive. Then the masked man made a fatal mistake. With a swift motion, his fingers flexed around the trigger, but it wasn't aimed at her. His eyes flicked briefly to the officers, distracted by their movement, even as they remained tense. That's all it took, one split second of weakness. Now or never. In one fluid motion, Maria dove to the side, rolling across the floor as the gunshot rang out. The sound of the bullet's impact hit the wall behind her with a deafening crash. Her heart was in her throat as she sprang up, using the momentum to push herself into a crouch, eyes darting toward even. Her son was still there, still frozen, but now, he was staring at her with wide eyes, his tiny hands clutching the doorframe. She couldn't let him see her fear. Not now. Even, get down. Now, Maria shouted, urgency seeping into her voice. It was the only command that mattered. She couldn't let this man turn his twisted game into something that would destroy them all. The masked man took a step forward, but it was too late. Maria was already on the move. Her training kicked in, and her body acted on instinct. She grabbed the nearest weapon, the heavy metal vase that had been knocked over during the chaos, and swung it with all her strength. It connected with the man's jaw with a sickening thud, and he stumbled back, momentarily disoriented. She didn't wait to see if it was enough. Her legs carried her toward the officers, her focus solely on the danger in front of her. She wasn't thinking about the past anymore, not about what had driven her to this moment, only what she had to do to keep Evan alive. The officers finally reacted, their hesitation gone. One of them moved in to tackle the masked man, but the other stayed near Maria, covering her back. "Get out of here," she screamed at them. "I'll handle this." The officer nearest to her looked at her, eyes wide, but he didn't argue. They both backed off, their training kicking in as they began to move toward the back of the house. The masked man recovered quickly, his eyes blazing with fury. He lunged forward again, but Maria was ready this time. She moved fast, faster than he could anticipate, and slammed her elbow into his chest, knocking the wind out of him. He faltered, but only for a moment. The smile returned to his lips, twisted and venomous. "You think this is over?" he growled. "You're just a pawn. All of you. You'll all fall in line eventually, just like I said." Maria's hands shook, but her resolve remained firm. She wasn't going to let him talk down to her, not when she had come this far. She wasn't just anyone's pawn. She was a mother, and she would protect her son, no matter the cost. Without another word, she darted forward, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back with a force that made him grunt in pain. The officers had the upper hand now. They were closing in, but she wasn't taking chances. With a final burst of strength, she wrenched the device from his hand, throwing it into the corner of the room where it shattered into pieces. The man gasped, trying to grab it, but the officers were already on top of him, forcing him down to the floor. Maria stepped back, her breath coming in shallow gasps, The room felt unreal, the world shifting in and out of focus as she realized that, for the first time in what felt like forever, the danger was truly over. At least for now. She turned slowly to Ivan, her heart breaking as she saw the terror still in his eyes. "Mom, you're okay," he whispered, voice trembling. Maria's knees buckled, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion, but she held on to her son with all the strength she had left. "We're okay now," she whispered, her voice hoarse but filled with a fierce, unwavering promise. "I'll always keep you safe." And in that moment, with her arms wrapped tightly around him, she knew that whatever threats were to come in the future, they would face them together.